Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Europe podcast, available every morning on Apple, Spotify or wherever you listen. It's Thursday, the 28th of November in London. I'm Stephen Carroll.
And I'm Anna Edwards. Coming up today, French borrowing costs match Greek levels for the first time as France's Finance Minister warns the country risks losing control.
Analysis from Bloomberg Economics suggests the Chancellor's tax hikes could cost UK businesses 130,000 jobs.
Plus, facing a much higher rate of rejection. Research shows black graduates are twice as likely to be denied top jobs in the UK.
Let's start with a roundup of our top stories.
France's finance minister says the country risks losing control if it doesn't pass a budget. Antoine Armand was speaking to France's BFM TV as the country has seen its borrowing costs rise over the looming crisis. The government faces a potential no-confidence vote over the budget, which could oust Prime Minister Michel Barnier within weeks. Our Paris bureau chief Alan Katz says far-right leader Marine Le Pen is the key figure to watch.
Is she going to vote to overthrow Barnier's government or not? The trend has been, at least in her rhetoric for the last couple of days, a week or so, has been more and more strident and seems more and more likely that she would vote for that. That said, it could all just be political brinksmanship, and she's just trying to extract some concessions from him, and she might sort of veer away at the last minute. And we really don't know for the moment what's going to happen.
Our Paris bureau chief there, Alan Katz, he was speaking after the French finance minister said he's prepared to make concessions on the budget to avoid the government being toppled. And this perhaps is an important point to linger on just a moment, because as a result of that, we have seen French over German spreads come down. They're now at 83 basis points from an earlier high of 86. So that is important. Barnier does face another hurdle today, though, when left-wing parties have called a vote in the National Assembly to repeal major reforms to the pension system, which were passed last year.
That easing of French bond yield comes after a number of unhappy milestones on markets over the political turmoil. The 10-year yields matched Greece's for the first time in trading a little earlier after the spread over German yields widened to the most since 2012. Yesterday, Klaus Bader, global chief economist at Societe Generale, says markets' fears may prove to be overblown.
We might want to talk this up to be a crisis, but it is not. It can still turn into a crisis. And much, of course, of the responsibility lies on the extreme right in France. Are they going to be the great disruptors, or are they going to support the minority government of Barnier to try to get, in particular, the fiscal house in order? And, of course, what they call in France la rue, i.e. is the population going to put up with what has to be done in order to get public finances back on an even keel.
Klaus Bader from Societe Generale there, speaking earlier on Bloomberg Radio. France's finances will face scrutiny from S&P Global Ratings on Friday, which could be the next catalyst for market moves. That's after both Fitch and Moody's gave it a negative outlook last month.
Back to the UK, the tax rises on UK employers announced in last month's budget could cost up to 130,000 jobs. That is according to new analysis by Bloomberg Economics of Chancellor Rachel Reeves' £26 billion of tax hikes. They say if bosses deal with higher employer national insurance contributions by reducing employment, it could mean the jobless rate rising by as much as 0.4 percentage points. The base case from Bloomberg Economics is that the impact of Reeves' employer tax hike will be spread evenly between prices, wage growth, hours worked and profit margins.
The UK's pharmaceutical, medical and transport equipment industries will be among the most exposed to any new tariffs which could be imposed by Donald Trump's administration. That's according to UN data analysed by McKinsey's Global Institute, which shows the US as the top export destination for 9 UK sectors. That's greater than the exposure for similar industries in France and Germany. Bloomberg's UK economy reporter Irina Angel says the country faces substantial risk.
The UK economy is definitely more exposed to US tariffs than we think it is. The UK likes to think of itself as a services superpower, which of course it is. So 2/3 of our trade with the US actually is in services. However, the UK is not immune to Trump tariffs.
Bloomberg's Irina Angel speaking there. Trade between America and Britain was worth in excess of £300 billion in the year until the end of March, but almost 2/3 of that came from services, which are not expected to be hit by tariffs.
Donald Trump had dinner with Meta CEO Mark Zuckerberg at the president-elect's Mar-a-Lago estate in Florida last night. Zuckerberg and Trump have had a contentious relationship in the past. In January 2021, Facebook banned the then president in the wake of the attack on the US Capitol. However, the two men have recently made amends. Zuckerberg called Trump's response to his first assassination attempt badass and congratulated him on his recent election win. I don't think that's a word I've ever said on radio before, Stephen.
First time for everything. Meanwhile, the US is weighing additional curbs on sales of semiconductor equipment and AI memory chips to China. The latest restrictions, which may be unveiled as soon as next week, would stop short of earlier proposals and affect fewer Huawei suppliers. Here's Bloomberg's Debbie Wu.
We are seeing that the Biden administration is weighing additional measures to China's access to chip equipment and then AI memory chips. But at the same time, previously we reported that there's going to be a 6 suppliers sanction, but now it looks like the Biden administration is only to sanction 2.
So that was Bloomberg's Debbie Wu, who says measures follow months of deliberations by US officials and negotiations with allies in Japan and the Netherlands. The Biden administration has also faced intense lobbying by American chip equipment makers who've warned that tougher measures would hurt their businesses.
Black applicants are twice as likely to be denied top graduate jobs in the UK. That is according to new research from consultancy Bain in partnership with the Black Talent Charter. Bloomberg's Tiwa Adebayo has the story.
Black graduates apply for more roles in finance, law and professional services, but are half as likely to receive an offer. And a new survey shows that rejection rates for those applying from outside the country's leading universities are even higher. That's a factor that does not apply to non-black applicants, according to the analysis. The findings come after Bloomberg reported that city firms are pulling back on diversity efforts more broadly. Natasha Ferguson, COO of diversity charity the Taylor Bennett Foundation, says conditions at some firms prevent progression for ethnic minorities.
The culture attracts young talent in, but the culture pushes middle talent out. Middle management is where you see the most concentration of diverse talent at the moment across all sectors.
That was Natasha Ferguson from the Taylor Bennett Foundation. When it comes to graduates, the research puts the disparity down to recruitment barriers, including socioeconomic factors and a lack of knowledge about the corporate world. In London, Tiwa Adebayo, Bloomberg Radio.
Those are your top stories on the markets. The stock 600 is 0.6% higher. The CAC 40 also up by 0.6%. US markets closed for a holiday. We are seeing oil prices, though, a touch lower. Brent crude's down 0.3% after OPEC Plus delayed a planned meeting from Sunday until next Thursday. Now in a moment we'll get more on the political turmoil here in France, plus get further details of that Bloomberg Economics analysis on the effect of the Chancellor's tax hike on employers. But another story that I've been reading this morning that I want to talk to you about is Beth Coates from Bloomberg Opinion has been writing about advice from Warren Buffett, but not about investing, about life.
Okay.
So she points to the fact that actually if you read in detail the things that Warren Buffett writes, oftentimes when he's making statements, or he actually kind of couches them with some life advice. And she points to his letter that came out on Monday, which was about donating $1 billion in Berkshire Hathaway shares to 4 family foundations, as actually advice on how you should leave behind a strong family, or how to leave behind a strong family and a lasting legacy. So this includes things like don't create dynasties.
Yes.
He says you should be leaving children.
Just in case I was thinking of creating one.
Indeed, yes, exactly. I know there are many keen listeners wondering when will the Edwards dynasty be formed?
Yeah.
But this is the idea that you should leave your children enough so they can do anything, but not enough that they can do nothing.
Yes, I liked the wording of that. Specific advice. Parents should leave their children enough so they can do anything, but not enough that they can do nothing. I'm not sure how many people this applies to.
Have that option, indeed.
But it's good to know that Warren Buffett, having been through these thought processes, has decided you should not leave too much to your children.
Indeed. And another point, given that it's Thanksgiving in the US, to also acknowledge your good fortune. And as he points out,
hashtag blessed.
Indeed, he's known for, of course, pointing out that he attributes a lot of his success to luck as well. A little bit less luck, though, perhaps, for the government in France, as we've been talking about this morning.
Segue.
Thank you. The Finance Minister Antoine Armand saying he's prepared to make concessions on the 2025 budget to avoid opposition parties toppling the government. We've got Bloomberg Opinion columnist Lionel Laurent with us from Paris for more. Lionel, good morning. At this stage, how close does the government look to collapsing?
So just to understand how we'd get to that collapse, it would come from a no-confidence vote after a budget, right? And this does not happen in history. You're not supposed to get, and you haven't traditionally got this kind of rejection of the government after the budget. Now, what you don't want is what's happened recently, which is a coin flip, right? Those are the odds. Le Pen has become increasingly vocal about a kind of no confidence motion. And even if on balance, it still looks incredibly risky for her to do such a move, you don't want a coin flip. So I think it's quite sensible for the government to say, we will look at concessions and try to bring the odds of that down, because I still think you just do not want a situation like this to hang on a kind of 50-50 odds.
Yeah, and Lionel, we heard from Marine Le Pen's party that the National Rally have said they hadn't decided whether they would basically bring the government down or not. So they've left that card still to be played. In the meantime, but then, the Finance Minister, Antoine Armand, saying that they are ready to make concessions. So that's the next step here, is it? They see if they can find something that would make this budget acceptable to Marine Le Pen, because this seems to have influenced bond spreads a little. We're seeing a little bit of a retreat in that spread of French OATs over German bunds.
Absolutely. And it makes sense, because we're still quite in the realm of manageable risk and manageable brinkmanship. Le Pen has made clear what she calls her red lines. She's talked about, for example, taxes on electricity. The problem here is basically that France needs a budget, and it needs to also have a budget that's acceptable to markets and European partners. So that means a lot of pain for everybody. And obviously in France, we are not a country that is used to, quote unquote, austerity or even any kind of budget discipline. So people are understandably shouting the loudest and beating their chest and saying, enough, this is really unfair. So there is, I think, a bit of choreography to this. And I think there is quite sensible attempt to find some concession that gives Le Pen the win that she's looking for and keeps the government going.
Because, of course, the options, if the government does fall, there can't be an election until next year. So we would end up essentially in a political limbo situation that surely doesn't benefit anyone.
Well, the thing is, I don't think we want to know what that's like. What kind of worries me about the debate at the moment is we are already starting to say, a bit like the US shutdown, when that comes along, we're starting to openly say, oh, what would happen? Well, it wouldn't be so bad, because we'd go to a sort of rollover budget. The institutions would sort of take over, this kind of feeling that actually it wouldn't be so bad. And that is exactly the kind of mentality you do not want in a country like France, the size of France, and with parties like Le Pen's and Mélenchon's close to power.
And just there's a pension vote happening today. Is this linked, Lionel, or is this separate?
This is separate. So there's actually less attention paid to this, because I think there's less likelihood of it passing. The problem, though, is that to get it not to pass, we're seeing all sorts of parliamentary antics that are more like sort of the UK during Brexit, or even the UK in the 1970s. It's filibustering, it's all sorts of tactics to basically stop this motion getting through. I think if it ever did get through, that would be a huge game changer, because if you have a France that is rolling back pension reform, rolling back reforms at a time when it should be trying to find even more savings, I think all bets are off in terms of how the markets would react.
OK, Lionel Armand, Bloomberg opinion columnist, thank you very much for joining us from Paris. You can read Lionel's latest pieces, by the way, bloomberg.com/opinion. Let's go next to this new analysis from Bloomberg Economics that says that tax rises for UK businesses announced by the Chancellor last month could cost as many as 130,000 jobs. That's if employers choose to pass on the burden of the £26 billion in tax hikes, which comes mainly from changes to national insurance contributions for employers. We've got Bloomberg's chief UK economist Dan Hansen with us for more. Dan, how did you arrive at this number, and how likely an outcome do job cuts seem from these tax rises?
Yeah, so what we did in terms of coming to the number is that we looked at sort of we're trying to put some guardrails around this debate, I think, because you read, over the past few weeks, you've read a lot about what may or may not happen with this. And we were trying to just at least from a macro perspective, assess, look at how sensitive firms have been to rising costs in the past and apply a sort of top end estimate to how many job losses there could be, and also on the flip side, how much prices could rise if they choose to adjust to the higher NICS costs through that channel as well. Because of course there are lots of ways they could sort of take this on. We know it's coming. It's possible wages don't increase as fast. It's possible they change their hiring plans or even lay people off, squeeze their margins, or put it through prices. So we were just looking at what are we think are the sort of extremities. Yes. Our base case is that probably spread across a range of these things, and no one is sort of the dominating factor. But if there is one that dominates, the scale of it isn't insignificant.
Right. Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? Because as soon as this measure was announced, this tax-raising measure, there was a lot of political debate about how exactly this was going to find its way into or not affecting workers and their pay packets and their hireability and the hours they work and all the rest. And the politics very quickly muddies the water. So really interesting to see your analysis, Dan, and the assessments you're making. So what sort of shift would that mean for the overall UK labour market?
Well, I mean, 130,000 jobs, it sounds like a lot of jobs, but, if you think about it in terms of the unemployment rate, it's 0.4 percentage point on the unemployment rate. So the unemployment rate now is at 4.3%. It would take you up to, 4.7%. I think that doesn't sound huge, but actually we've got into a place, I think, in the UK where we're so used to a 4% unemployment rate. If we're suddenly closing in on a 5% unemployment rate, I think the sort of dynamics change, particularly when you think about, well, there are two things to think about. One is, obviously, you've got the Bank of England and the interest rate angle, but the second is that historically there's a very tight relationship between job security and how much individuals tend to save. If you're worried about your job security, you tend to save more money. So you get this sort of feedback loop on the economy where you get job losses, but also people become more cautious about their spending. So it becomes a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. And I think that's the interesting one in terms of how it would play out, because I think no one's really expecting the jobs market. Everyone's sort of seeing the jobs market loosening modestly, but not cratering. If you have this sort of step change, I think it will just create a sort of, obviously it's a negative dynamic, but a dynamic that not many people are expecting for the coming year.
What's the alternative choice for companies if they don't go down the job cutting route? Is that price rises? Yeah, so there are quite a lot. It's not just job losses, even in terms of thinking about employment. It's hours as well. Think about total hours worked. They can scale back the number of hours people work. They can take the hit in their margins, but if you look at the data on margins, at least in a macro level, they look like they're sort of squeezed at the moment. So that may not be somewhere that firms can sort of take the cost. You're right, prices is another channel. Slower wage growth is another way they can deal with it. And the final one, which I think is very unlikely, but it is sort of, if you look in an economics textbook, it would tell you it's a possibility, is faster productivity growth, which is you just become more efficient, so your cost... Finally.
Yeah. This is what we needed to solve the productivity puzzle.
I've heard you tell me before that we needed that. So. Yeah.
So, that's the conundrum the Bank of England have been wrestling with for a very long time then. Dan, so what does this mean for the BOE if you've got, this complex dynamics then playing out in the market? I suppose they are doing the same analysis that you're doing to try and work out which of these levers businesses are going to pull to try and minimise the impact they feel. Yeah, well, I mean, I must be honest. I was listening to Bailey at TS, the Treasury Select Committee, and he said to Harriet Baldwin, who used to be the chair of the TSC, that they'd be writing to the TSC about sort of some of this sort of sensitivity analysis. So I thought that sounds like a good idea. So we might have a go at that. So the bank's going to come out and say something about this, assuming that letter gets published as well. I think all forecasters, as far as I can tell at the moment, are taking the assumption that it's sort of evenly spread or broadly spread across all those different channels we just discussed. So if you sort of look at it through that lens, the impact isn't going to be sort of no one channel dominates. There's no real reason to think it's going to change the course of the Bank of England. But obviously, if one of these, if employment dominates, the employment channel dominates, obviously that's calls for interest rates potentially to be cut a little bit faster. If the prices channel dominates, that obviously calls for interest rates to be cut a little bit slower. I mean, the main point is that we just don't know, and that's the half of the point of this analysis, is to put some sort of bands around where we might end up. And also that goes to where the bank are now, which is this argument around gradual rate cuts, is that they're just not, because this could go one way or the other, they're just not sure. They're just continuing to sort of move at a slow pace. But it was interesting to hear the Chancellor when she spoke to the CBI conference saying that essentially this was it and that she wouldn't be extracting more from businesses. I mean, is there a fear that, that she might need to do more
given the fiscal situation down the line. Of course, we're told not to expect another fiscal event until next year, but.
Yeah, during the election campaign, Labour said that they wouldn't raise 75% of the tax base. They made a commitment to do that, which is why we ended up with this employer NICS rise, because they needed to raise so much money. We've obviously had a rise in interest rates since the budget, which will eat into the very small amount of headroom that she has against her fiscal target. I mean, I think what it tells you, making that promise, is that they'll attempt to do it through squeezing the benefit bill, which is obviously what Keir Starmer's been talking about recently, and sort of getting people back to work and creating work incentives. So I think, the world is very uncertain, and the amount of headroom that was left in the budget against the fiscal rules was very small, and it's not hard to see how you'd have to come back and say we need to tighten fiscal policy a little bit more to reach our goals. So I think the promise just tells you that it will probably come on the spending side and not the tax side.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.